I've been a lawyer for 20 years, and I started my career as a civil litigator. I worked for two different law firms doing corporate type law, representing business owners and other companies who had commercial disputes. But in 2001, I left my corporate law job at an Oakland firm, and I went to work as a public defender in the poorest county in California, working there for the poorest people. And that was in Lake County, which at the time was about 100 miles north of where I was living in Berkeley. And for me, in doing that, I really found my calling as a lawyer. And for the past 15 years, I have devoted myself to helping represent the people who are the most disadvantaged in our legal system. That's folks who are charged with a crime, but who can't afford a lawyer to represent them. And currently, I'm a deputy public defender here in Marin County. I've done that for the past 13 years. So that's my current position.
Good. What are your views of the California prison system, Mike? And what have you heard that you think are good aspects of it? And what troubles you about the way California handles its prisoners?
Yeah. Well, as a public defender here in Marin, I represent a lot of clients at San Quentin State Prison. Which, as anybody knows who's driven across the Richmond Bay Bridge knows, is located here in Marin. And the way that happens is that people who are inmates incarcerated at San Quentin who are accused of committing new crimes in the prison typically can't afford to hire a lawyer, and they're charged in Marin County Superior Court, and the Public Defender's Office is appointed to represent them. I've done more San Quentin jury trials in the past 10 years than any other lawyer in private practice or as a public defender. And what that means is that I've had a chance to go into the prison, and I've been all throughout San Quentin State Prison while investigating the facts of these cases that we get. So I've been to the dining halls, I've been to all the cell blocks and the tiers, and I've been in the cells, and I've been in the infirmary, and just throughout the whole prison on the yards. I think that gives me a unique perspective on what it means to actually go to prison, beyond the fact of talking to my clients about the experience of being in prison. California has overpopulation in its prisons, and Governor Jerry Brown has made efforts through legislation to try to reduce that population so that people who are incarcerated are better served by their time there. Ideally, we wouldn't have prisons at all. If everybody could get probation and everybody could be restored to their community without going to prison, that would be best. But that's simply not possible. Some people aren't good candidates for probation, and they need to be in prisons. But I think that the whole, prison system could be improved in terms of treatment for people, so that when they are released, they're better equipped to be reintroduced to the community, not commit crimes in the future, and get treatment and other kinds of services that they need.
What do you see as the possibilities of bail reform? And do you believe judges have any role to perform in the reform movement, or is that something solely an issue for the legislature?
Yeah, bail is a very problematic area, and it's a place where discrimination, I think, shows itself quite a lot. First of all, against poor people, because if you're accused of a crime, you're entitled to the same rights and the same kind of due process as anybody, whether you're rich, poor, or otherwise. And yet, if you're a pretrial detainee, in other words, you're accused of a crime, but you haven't yet been found guilty, and you can't make bail, you're going to be incarcerated, essentially in the same conditions as somebody who has already been convicted of that crime. And the fact is that minorities also suffer discrimination when judges make the decision about how much bail ought to be set in the case. First of all, it is kind of a bizarre thing to assign a monetary sum to a particular person and a particular act that that person is accused of. But that's the system that we have and have to live with. Judges, though, have to be aware of not only a racial bias that might come out, but the fact that there's kind of implied or unconscious bias that has been shown to exist in judges who might think that they're otherwise neutral. I think that what you want in a judge who's setting bail is somebody who has experience with many, many thousands of cases. And that's where I spend my working life, is in the courtroom, witnessing and participating in the life of the courtroom. And setting bail is something that you can only do intelligently if you know where in the kind of continuum of seriousness a particular person and the particular allegations fall. And that's where having the experience that I have, having represented thousands of clients in criminal court, helps in giving me a good perspective as a judge on where this case ranks in this kind of hierarchy of seriousness.
What is your assessment of the role of restorative justice in our community here in Marin? And is there a place for it with adult offenders?
Absolutely, absolutely. Go ahead.
Well, because most of the work has been done with juvenile offenders or in schools or not with adults. To my understanding, we really haven't moved into the adult arena at this point.
Yeah, I mean, Marin County does have a number of specialty courts that are considered restorative justice courts. We have a court that's directed at helping people who are primarily drug addicts, whose drug addictions have driven their crimes, whether they're property crimes, crimes of violence, or drug crimes. We used to have a veterans court that sought diversion for people who had been in combat and that had affected their behavior. But I mean, the goal in any sentencing, whether it's a restorative justice type sentencing or otherwise, is to restore everybody involved in the process: the victim, the community, and the defendant. And that means trying to bring together, defendants back into the community once if they've been convicted, serving their time. At the Public Defender's Office, we try to help our clients not just with the immediate legal problems that are presented, but with the underlying social conditions that might have led them to getting arrested. And on behalf of my clients, I'm always thinking about their broader life issues. Is this somebody with a mental illness who could benefit from mental health treatment? Is this person somebody who needs to go into a residential drug treatment program? And the goal there is to avoid these people reoffending, which I have an interest in happening just as much as anybody else. I don't want my clients to get rearrested. So restorative justice should be the goal for every player in the criminal justice system. Well, I'm a criminal practitioner, but I did practice civil law for 5 years. The New York Times just did an article about the diminishment in the number of jury trials in general, both in criminal and in civil cases, and interviewed a bunch of federal judges, some of whom had done like 2 trials in the past 4 years, and they were lamenting the loss of the jury trial, which really represents the apotheosis, if you will, of the citizen's right to due process of law. But the whole alternative dispute revolution that started some decades ago was designed to relieve the courts of the burden of adjudicating disputes. The problem is that if you bargain away your rights to trial, you may not receive what the law expects you to receive in the way of due process. And that's typically in the civil context. In the criminal context, though, overcharging by DA's offices and the kind of overwhelming threat of receiving a terrible sentence in the event you lose operates as a deterrent to 95% of the people who end up in criminal court because those people plead guilty. And that's where sentencing really comes in, and that's where you want a judge who has spent his or her career in the courtroom practicing law and seeing and participating in sentencing hearings, because sentencings in criminal court are the main work of what judges do. 95% of people plead guilty don't exercise their right to a trial. They voluntarily do that by waiving their right to a trial because they perceive that there's a benefit in doing so. But then it's up to the judge to impose a fair sentence. And in doing that, you really want a judge who has spent his or her career in the courtroom and spent decades or at least years in the courtroom and can think of alternative types of sentences, be more flexible, and also have a knowledge, again, a kind of a data set of understanding about where a particular case belongs in the kind of spectrum of cases in general that come in front of the court in order to arrive at a fair sentence in relation to other like cases. I'm from New York City, but I grew up here in Marin. I went to Tam High. My aunt and uncle ran a bakery. My mom was a school teacher. In my job, I represent ordinary people in Marin County, poor people. So nobody knows better than me that Marin County has a poor population, indigent, can't afford to hire a lawyer. These are the folks that I represent on a day-to-day basis: immigrants, mentally ill people, homeless people, San Quentin State Prison inmates. And in doing that, in sticking up for their constitutional rights, which is what my obligation is as a lawyer under the Sixth Amendment, I am sometimes required to make some of the toughest and most consequential decisions that any lawyer can ever make in a case. I've gone to trial in a case where my client faced the possibility of receiving a life sentence if convicted. And frankly, there's nothing that really focuses the mind like the prospect of your client going to prison for the rest of his life. And I think that making those kind of tough decisions about whether to plead guilty, go to trial, whether to testify, what evidence to put on, those are the kinds of consequential decisions that are directly analogous to what a judge is going to be expected to make from the bench. And I think that having the experience of having been in that stressful situation, of having to make a tough decision in view of what the law requires and what the law permits, I don't think that there's any better preparation than that for being a judge. And the final thing I want to mention, because I know we're running out of time, is Marin is a unique place in the sense of how our judiciary is kind of composed, in that we don't have any judges currently on our bench who spent their careers in a public defender office. Despite that, the vast majority of criminal cases coming through our court system are public defender cases. And in that, Marin really stands alone among the 9 Bay Area counties. So if elected, I would, I believe, restore a sense of balance to a judiciary that has no judge on the bench who ever worked in a public defender office, in contradistinction with every other county in the Bay Area where it's kind of recognized that it's helpful to have judges that came from varied backgrounds.
So tell me, what's the last book you read, and where do you hang out when you're not taking care of your kids and judging?
From a literary point of view, I mean, I love Melville, the kind of Americanism of Melville, Nabokov. What I do in my personal life is, my wife and I live in Sausalito. I do a lot of cycling. I do a lot of woodworking. In fact, I have some marks on my hand from I was talking to you earlier. I work both in civil litigation and in criminal law. I have experience in both of those areas. Mostly, though, I have experience in the courtroom. I've done over 50 jury trials. I've spent thousands of hours in the courtroom. I've done thousands of hearings and represented thousands of people. There's no better preparation for being a judge than being in the setting in which that judge is expected to do his or her work, and that's what I bring to the table here.
Well, thank you both for coming here. I'm involved in your profession. I think you're 2 great candidates, and I wish you a lot of luck.